If you watched my previous videos, you already know that the Pacific frame is back with fresh paint, the headset is in place and the fork is mounted again. For me, this is always the point where a project comes to life. Up to here, I'm still dealing with options. From this point on, I'm making decisions and every part I install either supports the direction of the build or works against it. This is no longer about putting an old bike back to a rideable state. It is about giving a decent frame a new purpose. Doing it in a way that stays true to the DNA of the frame. I start with the rear wheel, because that is where the old logic of the bike becomes most obvious. The wheel is built around a 7-speed Dior DX hub, and I still have a lot of respect for those old hubs. They are durable, quiet, and mechanically straightforward. There is nothing wrong with them, but this hub simply gets in the way of a different setup. That is why I changed the free-hub body. The old 7-speed cassette comes off, the axle comes out, and the original free-hub body has to go. In practical terms, this is mainly dismantling and a full service. In terms of the build, this is where the bike starts leaving its old role behind. An 8-speed free-hub body from an STX RC hub proves to be the ideal replacement for my build, together with the matching axle. That change matters because it opens the door to a wider range of drivetrain options that the original setup could never cover. While taking the free-hub body off, I noticed something else. The drive side spokes are badly damaged. I have seen this often enough to know what I'm looking at. At some point in the past, the chain must have dropped between the cassette and the spokes, probably after a bad shift and a bent derailleur hanger. The wheel kept that memory. My list of jobs gets longer right away. So I start loosening all the drive side spokes and go straight into wheel building. I would love to be able to ignore this kind of damage, but I can't. If I know this damage is there, I don't want to have any surprises later on the trails. So there is only one option: replace the drive side spokes and make the wheel fit for the job again. I start by removing one of the damaged spokes to check it properly and measure the right length for the replacement. At that point, the decision is confirmed. The spoke is bent, marked, and damaged. I do not negotiate with parts like that. If a spoke is clearly done, then I believe it. That means the whole drive side gets rebuilt. From that moment on, this is no longer just a drivetrain conversion. It is also a proper upgrade for the wheel set. Rebuilding a wheel is one of those jobs where I can fully settle into the task. I know the sequence, I know the pattern, and I know exactly where I'm going. But the most important part is still how it feels. Tension has to come up evenly. The wheel has to respond calmly to correction. Nothing about it should feel forced. That is where I feel most at home. You can learn wheel building from books, and I learned it that way, or from videos and manuals. But there is another layer beyond that. There is the layer where experience begins to matter. You learn how much tension feels right at a certain stage. You learn when to stop correcting. You learn when a wheel has settled and when it still fights you. That is the level I'm interested in here. I'm not trying to turn this into an overbuilt exercise in measuring spoke tension and so on. This wheel will never be a modern high-end piece of tech. I'm just showing the kind of work that makes sense in the context of this bike. And I'm completely relying on all the wheels I have built over the years. The reason I give this wheel so much space in the video is that it changes the meaning of the whole bike. Once the free hub is changed and the wheel is rebuilt, the old 3x7 mountain bike logic no longer defines the project. The bike moves into a different technical territory from this point on, and that change starts at the rear wheel, not at the handlebar, the controls or the derailleurs. Without this rear wheel, all the other mods would be pointless. When I put the finished wheel back into the frame, the bike is still not complete, but something important is settled. The wheel is straight again, the tension is right again, and the mechanical basis for the new drivetrain is finally there. That is the first moment where I feel the build moving properly forward in a meaningful way. After that, the work becomes quieter for a moment. I grease the seat tube, reinstall the original seat post and put a random saddle from my stash back on, using the original clamp. I do like moments like that, because they preserve a small line of continuity inside a build that is otherwise moving quite far away from the bike's original setup. Then the bottom bracket goes back in. That is one of those components that disappear once the bike is finished, but it defines a lot of what happens around it. If it is not right, the drivetrain will give me trouble later. I have learned that lesson the hard way, so I do not rush this part. Clean threads, careful installation, correct preload. and then I can leave it alone. The crank is a polished Dior XT M730, originally a triple, now converted into a 2x setup with a 28 on the inside and a 44 on the outside. This is one of those points where I step away from catalog logic quite deliberately. I know what the part was intended to be, and I also know that it can do something else perfectly well if the rest of the system is built around that decision. That is a recurring theme in this build. I'm not ignoring the technical logic of the parts, I'm adapting them to my needs. The derailleurs follow after that. Both are the original Dior DX units from the bike. After a full clean and fresh grease, the rear derailleur gets narrower pulley wheels so it can guide a narrower chain properly. That sort of modification sits exactly on the line I'm interested in. It is not random mixing, and it is not manual approved purity either. It is adjustment based on experience. Is not whether a technical manual would describe it this way. The important thing is whether the system runs properly once it is adjusted. Once I mount the cockpit with the quill adapter, the headstem and the on-one midge bar, the whole bike changes its stance. That is always one of the strongest visual shifts in a build like this. At that point, I no longer see an old mountain bike waiting to be rebuilt. The new direction is clear. Then I go back to the bench and prepare the cassette. It is a used 10-speed cassette, so before I put it on the wheel, I want it clean and ready. I'm not particularly romantic about used parts. I do not install them because they are old. I install them if they are still worth using. That is also part of the logic of this build. I'm not trying to make it look expensive. And I'm not trying to make it artificially cheap either. I'm simply using the parts that make sense, both technically and in terms of budget. Once the cassette is cleaned, it finally settles on the rebuilt wheel. And suddenly, the whole rear wheel finally belongs to the drivetrain I had in mind from the beginning. Now the rear wheel goes back into the frame for good, and I return to the rear brake. That is the kind of work that does not look very dramatic on camera, but it has a direct effect on how the bike feels later. I make small corrections, take another look at pad position, change the spring balance, make a final check on clearance and repeat that until the brake feels balanced and calm. I do not need maximum brake power. I need a brake that behaves properly and gives me good control at the lever. From there I move on to the controls, and that means the bar and shifters. The shifters themselves are not the tricky part. The routing is. I want the front end to remain visually quiet, which means I do not want loose loops of cable hanging around the bars like washing lines. I want the housing to disappear under the bar tape and still follow a clean line that works mechanically. That is a small detail, but it makes a big difference to how the bike feels as a whole. If the routing is untidy, the whole front end starts to look busy and unresolved. If the routing is right, it almost disappears and works properly. So I take my time here. I test housing length, look at the bends, check the line around the bar again and again, and slowly build the route I want. This is the first moment where I can really check whether all those decisions from earlier in the build are beginning to line up. The mixed drivetrain, the changed pulley wheels, the cassette, the front setup, the cable routing. It all meets here. And this is exactly the kind of moment I enjoy in a build like this. There is still uncertainty in the system, but you can already feel whether the idea is technically sound. Once that rough function check looks right, I fix the shift housing to the bar. This is still preparation, but it is an important step. Once the bar tape goes on later, I do not want to rewrap it just because one housing section sits in the wrong place or creates pressure where it shouldn't. So, this is one of those invisible steps that I prefer to do slowly once rather than regret later. Then I add the brake cables. I do not show much of the final brake adjustment here, because I simply forgot to shoot some good footage of it. But I'm fine with that. For my next video, I will take better care of this. What matters is that the cables now follow the same logic as the shift lines. The front end starts to become one unit. Not because I need it to be fancy, but because now the final look will be quiet and clean. Once the cables stop working against the shape of the cockpit, the whole front end becomes easier to look at. Running an 11-speed chain in a setup that combines 7, 9 and 10-speed parts may sound odd at first, but there is often more room than the official technical manual allows for. I'm using an older pair of SPD pedals from the mountain bike world, and they fit the build perfectly well. Again, I'm not chasing purity here. I'm looking for parts that are proven, useful and appropriate. Now I start adjusting the drivetrain properly. This is where the whole setup really has to prove itself. I run through the gears, go back, adjust cable tension, check the limits, run through them again and continue until the shifting becomes quiet and predictable. And this is also the point where the mixed nature of the drivetrain either works or exposes itself as a bad idea. Because, strictly speaking, this whole setup runs very close to the edge of what still would work properly. Different generations, different original chain width, different original product lines from different brands, all brought together in one system. That is exactly why I rely so heavily on practical experience here. Technical manuals have to define things in straight lines, They have to define clear applications, clear boundaries, and clear combinations. I am working in a slightly different space. I'm still respecting the technical basis, but I'm also relying on what I've learned by actually building and riding bikes in this territory. And once the system runs properly through the gears, that is the only proof I need. After that, I add the chainstay protector. This is a simple old plastic part. The kind of thing people used to call a shark fin back in the 90s. I mount it with double-sided tape and zip ties. It is not elegant, and I'm completely fine with that. I actually like the honesty of parts like this. They do not pretend to be overbuilt. They just do their job, and that is good enough for a bike like this. Then I return to the cockpit for one last little detail. The top of the stem adapter is still open, so I close it with a plug and give it a final touch with a crown cap. Bar tape is one of those last jobs I still have to concentrate on. It is out of my comfort zone of grease and wrenches, but it closes the whole front end and strongly shapes the look of the bike. Once the tape is on, at that point the cockpit is finished, and with it the build itself is basically complete. Now you see the bike finished in the workshop and then outside. It started as an all-terrain bike from a time when there was not yet a separate bike for every type of riding. It had to fit many purposes. Then I stripped it down, rethought it, and rebuilt it for something different. I did not erase what it used to be, and I did not try to force it into some fashionable category either. But now I think it serves its new purpose as a bikepacking machine very well. I simply took this frame seriously enough to ask what else it could become, and then I built my answer.